in 1862, when American citizens had taken up arms against this country, Congress adopted a new oath to help make sure no person who had supported the rebellion could hold a position of public trust. Therefore, Congresspersons and United States federal government employees were required for the first time to swear an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That oath was put to test on January 6, 2021.
Foreign and domestic. From the Constitution's founding to the oath history we heard there has always been an awareness that democracy and safety can come in peril by our own fellow Americans. Chairman Thompson was referencing that last night. It may have went right by some people because a lot happened, but it was quite a striking moment and a historically accurate one. The oath that many view as a kind of symbolic gesture that people do when they become members of Congress, we're showing you many of those from recent times, is actually a version of the ironclad oath that was used after the Civil War. And there was nothing symbolic about it. It was actually a kind of litmus test at the time. Southern rebels could not truthfully swear to that oath had they attacked the country, and they could be barred from office or voting or charged with perjury if they were someone who did do those things and were trying to sneak through the loophole of the oath by claiming otherwise. Now, many people don't think practically about that oath or the president's oath to defend the country from enemies, foreign and domestic. Never in our over 200-year history have people, even with the great and deep differences in our nation, had to wonder whether the president would become an enemy, whether the president would observe, for example, an armed attack on the seat of government, be it from foreign terrorists or domestic, as I'm emphasized here tonight, and that president would do nothing because some enemies would not be enemies to the eyes of that president. As the chairman said there, January 6th tested all of this. And the question is, what do we do with history as a roadmap here, given that we have been tested before, we have had armed rebellion before? And how did the story of these hearings continue to confer some historical weight as they go on through the next weeks? For that conversation, we have a little bit of the past and a little bit of the present. Michael Beschloss is NBC News presidential historian, no better guest to talk about that history of rebellion. And here in the present, we have a former Obama advisor, political strategist, Che Komanduri, about the rhetorical and communication challenges of holding the nation's attention in the coming hearings. Michael, begin with you and your thoughts on that little bit of history the chairman shared and how it applies.
I'm so glad he mentioned it, and I'm so glad you mentioned it, Ari, because here's a case where what people were saying at the end of the Civil War, people from the North, the victorious side, said, we've won the Civil War, but we're in danger, because without an oath like this that will keep these people out of positions of public trust, who's to say that old Confederate senators will not run for the Senate again and get elected, and they will use their purchase in the Senate to try to have another Civil War and another offense against the federal government, just as happened in Fort Sumter with the firing on Fort Sumter in 1861. And they were absolutely right, because as you both know, there was a Confederate president whose name was Jefferson Davis. Davis was a former senator from Mississippi. And Davis, after 1865, took him a couple of years, but he began giving speeches. And what did Davis say? Davis said, the South never lost the Civil War. Actually, we won, but it was stolen from us. And we've got to do something to get that back. Who does that remind you of?
Powerful and well put. And Che, we wanted to bring you into this segment because you've been very thoughtful about how do you do effective communication or governing within these extreme environments. And one of the challenges of standing up to extremism is that you can start to look extreme. In the dawn of the Trump era, some people who were genuinely concerned and issuing warnings were written off as histrionic. People can judge for themselves whether the warnings were borne out. Trump left the way he left office, and we see that. What do you see as the challenge for Democrats, and how are they navigating it in trying to wake everyone up in these hearings without having it sound like every hearing is, oh my God, a 5-alarm fire, in a way that reduces the significance? How do you navigate that?
Yeah, I think, quite frankly, the Democrats have nailed it. I think it's been a perfect 10 in terms of the execution of this hearing. I think that the way they have packaged this, the way they have sort of really tried to tell a story, a specific story about what happened. Donald Trump said X, Y happened. That is the way this hearing is proceeding. And I think that's crucial going forward in terms of telling the story of this hearing. I do think the challenge actually will not be for Democrats the hearing. I think this challenge will be what comes after the hearing. And there, I think history gives us two very different examples. So I'll bring up Watergate, where, the hearings concluded, articles of impeachment were adopted. There was a definite follow through. There were definite action items. Barry Goldwater went to the White House. The rest was history. The other one I bring up is Iran-Contra. And Iran-Contra was a situation where Democrats had the hearings. There were no action items. There was really no follow-up. There was no real argument that Ronald Reagan and the Reagan administration needs to be held accountable. Oliver North kind of swept in and made an appeal to conservative tribalism, which is exactly what Tucker Carlson is doing now. And the result was the hearings had no impact. A year later, voters went to the polls, didn't even think about the Iran-Contra scandal when they re-elected the Reagan administration to effectively stay in power. Those action items, that follow-up, what follows these hearings, I would argue, is going to be more crucial towards the outcome of how this will be remembered than the hearings themselves. I think the hearings themselves have been tremendous. Great moments. Liz Cheney was tremendous. That is a world historical moment, I think, that she had last night. I think Ivanka Trump, that was one of the most talked about moments really today on social media, was what she said about her father and then what her father today said about her. But I think it's what comes after the hearings where the challenges lie.
Yeah, all fair points. Michael?
Well, this was a plot against democracy. I thought it was evident on the day it happened. I was just looking back. I did a tweet at 2:47 p.m. during this attack saying, this is a coup d'etat by the President of the United States. It's not that I was so prescient. It was because you began to see who could benefit and what Trump said about people marching to the Capitol. So this was sort of hiding in plain sight. But the point is that this was done by a president who was happy to dismantle our system. And he was doing it, we're increasingly finding, arm in arm with people who can be fairly described as domestic terrorists, some of the groups that you were talking about earlier this hour. And, more than that, if it had succeeded, let's just think about that for a moment. 6th of January, historically, we might not have this program to be saying what we think on the air right now. What would be the role of the military be in the society? Would there be martial law? Would there be invocation of the Insurrection Act? Would there have been a move by President Donald Trump, who is holding on to a second term that he didn't deserve, to jail his enemies? We don't know any of that, but that's what's at stake. And unless we identify those guilty, punish those guilty, and as Shay was saying, pass reform laws to make sure it never happens again, all of us in this country will live under a sword of Damocles.
All important points. Michael Beschloss and Shay Cohen Dury, I want to thank you both. I hope people are listening.